I request Dr. TCA Raghavan, Director General, I request Dr. TCA Raghavan, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, to kindly make the welcome remarks.
Your Excellency, Mr. Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, President of the Republic of South Africa, Your Excellency, the First Lady, Dr. Shepe Motsepe, Shri Narendra Modi, Prime Minister, members of the Council of Ministers of South Africa, members of the delegation from South Africa, Your Excellency, Mr. Andre Arhana Correa do Lago, Ambassador of the Federative Republic of Brazil, members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, good afternoon and happy Republic Day in advance. It is a privilege for the Indian Council of World Affairs to host the first India-Brazil-South Africa Gandhi Mandela Memorial Freedom Lecture. That the lecture is being delivered by His Excellency, the President of South Africa, in the presence of our respected Prime Minister, enhances the quality of this occasion. On the eve of our 70th Republic Day, Mr. President, your presence also coincides with the 150th birth anniversary of the father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi. In September last year fell the centenary of the birth of Nelson Mandela, and this was commemorated by the United Nations in South Africa, in India, and indeed all over the world. There is a special significance to the legacy of these two great thought and action leaders being observed as an event to commemorate another important anniversary. This is the 15th year since the founding of the grouping comprising India, Brazil, and South Africa, IBSA in short. IBSA countries decided to celebrate the occasion with 15 events held in all three countries over 2018-19. This Freedom Lecture is a flagship event of that series. The idea of a commemorative lecture series, the Gandhi Mandela Freedom Lecture, was enthusiastically endorsed by the IBSA foreign ministers during their meeting in New York in September 2018. IBSA is a grouping spanning 3 continents, 3 countries with similar histories of colonization, 3 developing countries, and most of all, 3 democracies. IBSA's success demonstrates most vividly the desirability and feasibility of South-South cooperation beyond the conventional areas of exchange of experts and training. For instance, the IBSA Fund for Alleviation of Poverty and Hunger, established in 2003, is a unique initiative through which development projects are executed with IBSA funding in fellow developing countries. Our aspirations are common: a better quality of material and spiritual life for our peoples, and to build societies that are pluralistic and inclusive. These were the very aspirations that had guided the thoughts and actions of Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela. All 3 partner countries are multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-religious nations and democracies. In brief, IBSA brings together 3 democracies and economies from 3 continents to 1 platform. Respected Prime Minister, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are most fortunate to have the President of South Africa to deliver the first Gandhi Mandela Freedom Lecture. His own career in public life is a story of the struggle to attain the very goals and ideals of Gandhiji and Nelson Mandela. Legal studies, political struggle, imprisonment, and being part of the leadership of the African National Congress that negotiated South Africa's transition to freedom and democracy, being chairperson of the Constitutional Assembly that wrote a new constitution for South Africa. All these are elements which have much in common with the two leaders we commemorate today. Mr. Ramaphosa also has an investment and business background, which makes his presence today in an IBSA commemorative event all the more relevant. Mr. President, on behalf of the Indian Council of World Affairs, I have the honor to request you to deliver the first IBSA Gandhi Mandela Freedom Lecture. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, Prime Minister Modi, honorable ministers and deputy ministers from both South Africa and India, President of the Indian Council of World Affairs, Dr. Raghavan, Ambassador of Brazil in the Republic of India, the High Commissioner Kombaj, High Commissioner of the Republic of India to the Republic of South Africa, the Chargé d'Affaires of the Republic of South Africa to the Republic of India, members of the diplomatic corps, and ladies and gentlemen. On this, my first official visit to India as the President of South Africa, it is a great honor to have been called upon to deliver the very first India, Brazil, South Africa, Gandhi Mandela Freedom Lecture. Since the end of apartheid in 1994, India and South Africa have had close political, cultural, trade, and strategic ties in a number of other areas. This cooperation has been further deepened since South Africa joined the BRICS group in 2010. India was one of the first countries in the whole world to recognize democratic South Africa after the attainment of our freedom. The Red Fort Declaration, signed by first President of Democratic South Africa, President Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, during a state visit in 1997, is rooted in Afro-Asian solidarity and has given rise to a successful and enduring strategic partnership between the two countries. Our partnership is based on shared values and common interests that are underpinned by a common vision of freedom, development, peace, and prosperity, not just for our respective countries, but for the peoples of the world. I want to acknowledge and thank the people of India for the encouragement, the inspiration, as well as the practical support that they extended to us during our struggle for liberation. This extension of great generosity was also eloquently expressed by Nelson Mandela in one of his letters from prison in 1980. We know that this support, which India gave unreservedly in aid of our struggle, is due to our deep friendship and the progressive internationalism of successive governments of the people of India. India's leaders have been consistent in their solidarity with the liberation struggles, not just of South Africa, but of other countries as well, particularly on the African continent. In addressing the Asian African Conference in Bandung in 1955. It was one of your most outstanding leaders, Nehru, who told delegates, and I quote, "Everything else pales into insignificance when I think of the infinite tragedy of Africa ever since the days when millions of Africans were carried away as galley slaves to America and elsewhere. Half of them dying in the galleys. Even now," he continued, "the tragedy of Africa is greater than that of any other continent, whether it is racial or political. It is up to Asia," he said, "to help Africa to the best of her ability, because we are sister continents," close quote. We are indeed sister continents, and we are bound by the umbilical link of history. Indian people were first brought to South Africa as indentured laborers. And you can read as slaves, because being an indentured laborer those days essentially meant that you were a slave. They were brought in that form in 1860 to the shores of South Africa. They have retained their vibrant culture, their languages, their traditions, and values. This has in many ways added to the rich tapestry that is our country's multilateral society today. Many of these men and women and children who came in search of a better life to South Africa were subjected to some of the most inhumane conditions in the history of humankind on the sugar plantations of South Africa. After serving their indenture, slavery in parentheses, a large percentage of them returned to India. But many of others stayed, and they stayed and made South Africa their new home. It is testimony to the patriotism and the love for South Africa in this community that so many of the luminaries of the anti-apartheid struggle were of Indian origin. The South African Indian community did play a formative role in the freedom struggle in South Africa and after apartheid ended as well, particularly in the reconstruction of a new South Africa. We remember those great leaders, and some of whom are Yusuf Dadoo, Monty Naika, Fatima and Ismail Mier, Lalu Chiba, Bani Desai, Ahmed Timo, Ismail Mohammed, Amina Desai, Billy Naya, Yusuf Kachalia, Ahmed Kathrada, and many others who will be forever remembered for their contribution to the liberation struggle. Many of them rose to become gigantic figures also in our democracy. People like Ahmed Kathrada served many years in prison alongside Nelson Mandela. Ismail Mohammed rose to become the Chief Justice of South Africa. Ahmed Timo, who was recently recognized by the African National Congress and was given the highest honor that the ANC ever gives to people who have contributed to the struggle, was killed brutally by the apartheid police during apartheid. The South African Indian community also produced outstanding activists, as well as cadres who today serve with distinction not only in our government, but in a number of other areas, in the professions, legal profession, medical profession, business, engineering professions, and many others. This is the rich bequest that we as South Africans have earned from a tragedy that occurred in 1860 when people of Indian origin were brought to our shores in South Africa as slaves or indentured labor. Mahatma Gandhi's granddaughter, Ella Gandhi, played a leading role in the women's movement in South Africa and was among the first group of members of parliament of the democratic South Africa. These were all leaders of conviction and of principle, and many of them continue to be high-placed people of conviction and principle in the service of the people of South Africa. Those who have departed were unwavering in their belief in the unity of all the oppressed and stood firmly against any attempt by the racist apartheid state to divide our people along ethnic and tribal lines. This resolve still resides in the hearts and the minds of many people of Indian origin in our country. They believed and still believe, as has been the founding principle of the African National Congress, that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Today, we pay tribute to the life and the times of two of the greatest leaders and statesmen of their generations, and perhaps of all time. Mohandas Gandhi, fondly known as Gandhiji, and Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, known to all of us as Madiba, are those two statesmen and great leaders. Their legacies go far beyond their statures as the founding fathers of our two great independent nations, India and South Africa. What they lived for, what they stood for, and indeed what they fought for, continues to resonate with people across the world decades since their departure from this earth. They have influenced generations of leaders, not just in South Africa and India, but worldwide. Their thought on justice and liberty, on human dignity and human rights, and on a nonviolent resistance process continues to influence social and political movements in all four corners of the globe. They shared a common passion for and understanding of the principle of sustainable development decades before the term was even coined. They understood the importance of environmental conservation, of the development of rural communities, of agricultural self-sufficiency. They understood this as being the critical process in any nation's success. Gandhi and Madiba were products of their time. They were also products of the social, political, cultural, and other influences that made them, that shaped them, and molded them into what they became. Yet in many ways, they were men who were far ahead of their time. It is indisputable that they were great visionaries. It is equally indisputable that they were great thinkers as well. We often take for granted the sheer force of will, the courage, the conviction, and strength of character that would have been required to be a leader at such times. These were times when the clamor of the oppressed for justice and freedom was growing apace, matched only by the brutality of those who sought to crush them. When liberation came, instead of retribution and vengeance, they extended an olive branch to the former oppressor. They espoused ideals that weren't necessarily popular at the time and never populist, but they were grounded in the strong belief that resistance against an unjust system could never succeed if the oppressed sank to the same level of the oppressor. Their techniques of civil resistance, coupled with the moral force of their ideas, have endured through the passage of time. They serve as beacons of hope for many who continue to suffer race, gender, class, ethnic, religious, and other forms of oppression as well as of exclusion. This year, India marks 150 years since the birth of Gandhi, which coincides with South Africa's celebration of the centenary of Nelson Mandela's birth. We are privileged to claim these two icons as our own and to know, as we do, the deep impact and influence that Gandhi had on Mandela. As President of South Africa, I am particularly proud that the seeds of Gandhiji's political awareness were sown and given birth and rise in our country. Barely days after arriving in the country, that is South Africa, as a newly qualified barrister, he experienced the brutal treatment of apartheid, racial oppression, when he was forcibly removed from a train carriage that was supposedly reserved only for white people. This humiliating treatment of harsh racism spurred him to enter a life of political activism. Thus, the seed had been born in him to resist and to seek justice. This and a series of other forms of degradation at the hands of the colonial authorities in South Africa awakened in Gandhi a keen passion for justice and equality amongst people. He would later write that this forced him to reflect on the nature of oppression, on the law as an instrument of oppression, and on the pervasive belief of racial superiority held by the European colonizers in India, South Africa, and elsewhere. He then began mobilizing the local Indian community and helped found the Natal Indian Congress in 1894 and became its first secretary. The organization was the first in South Africa to bring together Indians of all classes, and during its inception, it advocated for the rights of Indian traders who faced discrimination in the then Natal province of South Africa. This was later broadened to supporting the interests of all local Indian community in general. It was at the helm of the Natal Indian Congress that Gandhi first began to articulate his position on civil disobedience and the philosophy that he so well espoused, Satyagraha, A defining moment for the Satyagraha movement was in August in 1908, when Gandhi encouraged those present to burn their identity documents outside the Himandiya Mosque in Johannesburg. More than 2,000 of these ID documents were burned that day, and mass arrests followed. The ANC's defiance campaign and the anti-pass campaigns that began in the 50s and that were also extended into the 1980s were very much influenced by Gandhi's approach to passive resistance. Decades after its formation, the Natal Indian Congress and later the South African Indian Congress joined hands with the country's other liberation movements, including the African National Congress, in organizing against the repressive apartheid system. The South African Indian Congress was one of the organizations that was responsible for organizing the Congress of the People in Kliptown in 1955 on the 26th of June. It was here that the Freedom Charter, the precursor to South Africa's democratic constitution, was adopted. It was a firm statement of the commitment of the people of South Africa to a path of non-racialism. For Madiba, Gandhiji was an inspiration and a role model. In tracing the evolution of his political thought as laid out in his writings and speeches, we see clearly the confluence of history, the confluence of experience and pragmatism, as we have seen with those of Gandhi. Gandhi's formative activism focused on the plight of the vulnerable Indian minority in South Africa. His documented views, especially those around securing the franchise for Indians in South Africa, but also on Western civilization, on racial hierarchies in India, or on secularism, could today be read through a different prism. But of this we are certain. They believed in the innate dignity of the human being, in the moral authority of a non-violent mass resistance to oppression, and in the enduring strength of people's power. There are so many aspects to Nelson Mandela's legacy, but he is most revered for his commitment to a peaceful transition from apartheid to democracy, one that brought together the oppressed and the oppressor to finally have a democratic outcome. He was also able to put in process the healing of a deeply divided and broken society by promoting reconciliation between the races. Nelson Mandela drew inspiration from Gandhi's words that forgiveness is the attribute of the strong. Legacy is a complex phenomenon, as most of us will know, and it is by no means assured, even for the most revered leaders that we uphold. Both of these great leaders entered the political arena at a time that was vastly different to ours. The issues they advocated for and how they articulated them, the political positions that they took, and the political decisions that they made will always be subject to interpretation and reinterpretation. Those of us who have chosen a life of politics, like Prime Minister Modi and myself will know too well that the actions we undertake at a particular time will by necessity be held up to public scrutiny by future generations. There will forever be many people who are researchers, scholars, and intellectuals who will put the actions that we have taken under a microscope and try to find out what motivated us, what ideologies we were pursuing, and what principles we were adhering to. They may be praised, but they may also be derided or condemned. Yet we know that the transience of politics is one thing, and the enduring nature of universal values of justice, of equality, of self-sacrifice, of solidarity with the underdog are another. In paying tribute to Gandhi in 1997, Madiba said, "He showed us that it was necessary to brave imprisonment if truth and justice were to triumph over evil. The values of tolerance, mutual respect, and unity for which he stood and acted had a profound influence on our liberation movement and on my own thinking," Madiba said. This inspires us today in our efforts of reconciliation and nation building, close quotes. So concluded Madiba. Gandhi, like Nelson Mandela, was an internationalist. Long before the issue of apartheid was put on the agenda of the United Nations, he traveled to India to publicize the oppression of the colonial regime in South Africa. It was the government of India that was the first to request the United Nations General Assembly to confront racial discrimination in South Africa, and which banned trade and apartheid South Africa soon thereafter. 100 years since the birth of Nelson Mandela, and 150 years since the birth of Gandhi, we are proud to follow in their footsteps of progressive internationalism. We share a commitment to realizing a global community of nations at peace with each other and a world founded on social justice and human rights for all. In his first address to the United Nations General Assembly, President Nelson Mandela spoke of the interdependence between nations, saying that ensuring that democracy, peace, and prosperity prevail everywhere was the great challenge of our age. As we as South Africans take up our non-permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, South Africa is acutely aware of the responsibility we have been entrusted with. In Madiba's honor, we have chosen for our term the theme, "Continuing the Legacy, Working for a Just and Peaceful World." Continuing Nelson Mandela's legacy. The African Union's Agenda 2063 aspires to an end of conflict and the silencing of the guns on the continent of Africa by 2020. Serving on the United Nations Security Council affords us the opportunity to meaningfully contribute towards this goal. We are determined to ensure that Africa is not relegated to the periphery of world affairs. We want Africa to take its place, and in fact, we as Africans, with the active support of our sister continent where India resides, are saying this century is Africa's century. We will advance our foreign policy in a manner that champions the interests of Africa and her peoples, but we will do so with full respect and cooperation as well as collaboration with other countries around the world. And India is one of those that we count amongst the first that we seek collaboration and cooperation with. As a country, South Africa has come a long way since 1994. But while we look back on the achievements of the past 25 years, we also know much more needs to be done in our country to eradicate poverty, inequality, and underdevelopment. Yet we take to our challenges with vigor, knowing that the South Africa that Nelson Mandela dreamed of, the South Africa that Gandhi dreamed of, a democratic, non-racist, non-sexist South Africa, is indeed within our reach. As we build on our achievements, we applaud the governments of India, particularly in relation to its focus on Afro-India solidarity. This solidarity and cooperation has geopolitical, cultural, educational, technical, and economic aspects. Prime Minister Modi, the 10 guiding principles announced during your visit to Uganda last year stress the importance of an equal developmental partnership that will be to the benefit of all our people. South Africa looks forward to participate in the 4th India-Africa Forum Summit and to further advance collaboration between India and Africa within the framework of Agenda 2063. South Africa and India have come a long way in addressing our respective challenges of underdevelopment, economic and political marginalization. Both Gandhi and Mandela wanted to see a world free of racial discrimination, but it was the grinding poverty experienced by millions of people in the global South that pained them the most. They understood that unless poverty was addressed as well as eradicated, the highest level of human progress would not be attained. Through our cooperation on a range of platforms, such as being members of BRICS, being members of IBSA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, the G20, the G77 plus China, and the non-aligned movement, we will continue to work together in pursuit of a world that is free of poverty. The India-Brazil and South Africa Dialogue Forum, in particular, is a practical expression of our shared values of democracy, justice, human rights, and good governance. It prioritizes inclusiveness, human development, peace, transparency, social justice, and equity. As like-minded emerging economies, we recognize that we have a collective role to play in addressing, but more importantly, in correcting the imbalances of the global economy. The global economy is facing a number of challenges right now. And these are challenges of lackluster growth that will no doubt have an impact on growing or developing economies. IBSA countries have made substantial contributions in improving the lives of thousands of people through the IBSA Fund. Many of these activities have taken place quietly in the background without much fanfare, but have provided much-needed relief and hope to recipient countries. As South Africa, we look forward to deepening our relations with India through stronger commercial and people-to-people ties. We need to focus on growing our trade, increasing investment in each other's countries. The progress that we have achieved thus far is quite impressive. And in our meeting earlier this morning, we committed ourselves to increasing the cooperation between our two countries at all levels. We can be proud of the road our two countries have traversed, two sister countries that are separated by an ocean, but bound together by history, by the collective energies of our people, and by the deep friendship and respect we hold for each other. The legacies of Gandhi and Mandela have never been more important than they are today. They sacrificed personal advancement, both as lawyers, for the common good. And they used their talent and their craft as lawyers to advance the interests of ordinary people. Theirs was a lifelong pursuit of truth, righteousness, peace, and love in order to realize a better world. With so many parts of the world beset by conflict, we have to hold firm to the belief that peace indeed can be attained, that universal peace is possible, and that no person is too small or sees themselves as too unimportant or insignificant to play their part. It was Gandhi who told us, "Be the change you want to see in the world." One can ask oneself, what change would Gandhi and Mandela have wanted to see in today's world? And I would like to posit a thought and say, these two outstanding leaders of our times would have wanted to see the change in the world to be driven by increased respect for human rights across the world, harmony and peace in the world, a better life for all the people in the world, eradication of poverty and inequality. They would also have wanted to see a multipolar world where nations of the world respect one another, where cooperation amongst all the countries is the order of the day, where multilateralism is respected and upheld, and where there is tolerance of each other on a number of fronts: religious, racial, creed, class, regional affiliation, and many others. India and South Africa share a commitment to freedom and democracy, to non-racialism and tolerance, to social equity and the eradication of poverty. Let us strengthen the bonds that exist between our two countries and our peoples as we look to the future. For as we look to the past, we have great foundations. We have towering pillars that can continue to support our resolve to achieve all these ideals. And those towering figures are Gandhi and Mandela. Let us look forward to a future of hope and renewal, a future of peace and prosperity, a future that is bright and guided by the light of these two great men whose memory we are celebrating today. I thank you.
I would like to invite the Ambassador of the Federative Republic of Brazil to India, His Excellency Mr. André Correa do Lago, to give the vote of thanks.
Mr. President, Madam Ramaphosa, Prime Minister Modi, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Raghavan, thank you for including me in this extraordinary event, and I have to commend President Ramaphosa for this wonderful lecture that we were honored to hear. Today, we are all here to honor Gandhi and Mandela, and my mind is inevitably drawn to how India, Brazil, and South Africa, three dazzling singular countries, come to share so much in our values, in the plight of our history, and how natural it is for us to work together on the international stage, united by IBSA. Gandhi and Mandela are revered as champions in the struggle for freedom. They stood out, as wonderfully described by the President, for their courage and originality in facing evils of colonialism and racism with the message of conciliation, nonviolence, acceptance of differences, and peace. In Brazil, Gandhi and Mandela inspired the admiration of people of all backgrounds. And this is so, I believe, because we find and we recognize so much of our own ideals resonating with their messages. They are inspirations to all of us Brazilians. Like India and South Africa, Brazil had to rise from colonial rule and had to face the legacy of poverty, slavery, exploitation of native populations, and many other forms of injustice that colonialism left behind. And like India and South Africa, we chose to tread the path of peace. Brazil, it is said, is a child of diplomacy. In spite of our size and sharing borders with 10 other countries, we succeeded in stimulating negotiated outcomes. This has shaped our culture throughout history and established the confidence of the Brazilian people in diplomacy. Our nations find common ground, furthermore, in the vibrancy of our democracies. The strength of our institutions has allowed us to find novel, objective, and national solutions to our challenges. Brazil, after difficult years of political, economic, and moral crisis, has given President Bolsonaro a clear mandate to bring about a new moment for our country. President Ramaphosa, you met President Bolsonaro yesterday in Davos, since this year that India chairs IBSA, Brazil is chairing BRICS, President Bolsonaro is looking forward to welcome both of you, Prime Minister and President, in Brasilia at the end of the year. 15 years ago, the creation of IBSA provided a unique platform for our countries to find a common voice. IBSA brought together three dynamic, multi-ethnic, and multicultural democracies, three emerging economies seeking to play a larger role in world affairs. One from each of the three continents that were almost completely under colonial rule. But now, we are in the 21st century, and many of the best solutions for the problems that the world faces are developed in our countries, Our nations embraced our cultural diversity and know that our complexities and contradictions can become great strengths. We have, in fact, anticipated in our countries many of the central debates of the contemporary world. When we picture Gandhi and Mandela in our minds, we always remember them with a smile on their faces. By the way, here it is. I will now mention something that may a bit surprising, but is certainly very symbolic of our three continents. We have in common, our three countries, that we face very often with a smile, with optimism, many of the adversities and challenges that we have. When Gandhi died, a community of laborers in the city of Salvador in Bahia, descendants of African slaves, christened themselves the Sons of Gandhi. They mourned the Mahatma, but they too knew how to disarm their sorrows with a smile. Every year since, the Sons of Gandhi have paraded on the streets of Salvador Carnival, dressed in the likeness of the Mahatma, performing music and dances originated in Africa, uniting people of all races to bring a message of peace during Carnival. They are Brazilians, proud of our country's African roots and inspired by the Mahatma's example. Our natural confluence in multilateral fora about the many of the most pressing international issues today pays testimony to the strength of IBSA and how much we are yet to achieve working together. Because to this day, indignation at the unjust and the unjustifiable, which is the greatest force of historical progress, as they proved, has in democracy the best vehicle to influence reality. The leadership and coordination of our three countries towards sustainable development, as you mentioned, Mr. President, be it at the Conference of Johannesburg, Rio, or Hyderabad, I think would certainly please both Gandhi and Mandela. And I must here finish by expressing my gratitude to the Indian chairmanship of IBSA on its ongoing efforts to raise this forum to its real and full potential. Thank you very much.
All the guests are requested to kindly remain seated till the departure of high dignitaries and the delegation. I would now like to invite all our guests